Hello, everyone, and welcome to Existential Delight. My name is Dylan, and today we are going to be continuing a series here on the channel in which we go through G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. Today we'll be looking at Chapter 4, the Ethics of Alfland, which is personally my favorite chapter in Orthodoxy, and it might actually be one of my favorite chapters ever. I think it's magnificent. I think it explores topics that you don't really see explored all that much. Of course, it's got Chesterton's usual wit and wonder and joy, so it's really a beautiful chapter. It's beautiful from beginning to end, and we're going to explore the whole chapter in this live stream. I don't know how long the stream is going to be, but I anticipate it will likely be longer than an hour. So if you are here, I hope you enjoy it, because you are watching it live. And if you're watching in the future, hello to you too. I hope you're finding some value in these Chesterton breakdowns. I mostly do them because I just enjoy reading Chesterton, and I find myself reading the chapters over and over again to understand them better. And I tend to take a lot of notes when I'm reading, especially if I'm rereading something. And so these videos are my way of just showing you or simplifying a lot of the ideas and concepts that Chesterton goes through in the chapters. So, as we go through the reading, I've prepared a few slides, which I will put up on the screen, and I will show you the different ideas, how Chesterton conceptualizes them. I will break them down, I'll add some commentary, and then also what I'll do is I'm actually also just going to read the chapter. I recently contacted the G.K. Chesterton Society in America and asked them what are the copyright limitations in terms of reading and talking about G.K. Chesterton. And if my memory serves me right, pretty much anything before, I think it was 1925, is in the public domain, which means that Orthodoxy is actually in the public domain. So me just reading it to you, I'm not violating any legislation. So that's good news. And that means that I can give you the full text and also just break it down. If you've never read Chesterton at all, and if you've never read Orthodoxy, then you're going to get a full reading in this video. And of course, if you want to go back and check the previous chapters, you can also do that. Each chapter sort of builds upon the previous one, but each chapter has its own unique ideas. So even if you did miss something in the previous one, it's not the end of the world if you skip those for now and just watch this one. But if you are interested and you like the ideas, then feel free to jump back. I will put a link to that playlist with all the different chapters in the description of this video, and the plan is actually to go through all the chapters at some point. So just a few logistical things. I did get a new camera, thanks to the support of people who watch the channel, which is just really wonderful. So the quality's improved a lot. The audio quality was always pretty good, but now the video quality is a lot better. So I would just like to ask you, if you are watching now and you are live, let me know in the comments or in the live chat, how is the sound? How is the video? Can you hear me? Can you see me? With live streams, I am always at the mercy of technology, so it really helps if you can just drop me a message. I see we have a few viewers, which is wonderful, so thank you for being here. And without further ado, let's turn to the chapter and let's begin exploring. So before I even begin reading, let's just consider the name of the chapter first, the Ethics of Alfland, which, as you'll see, we're going to be talking about fairy tales and fables and legends and why they are actually of extreme importance, why you don't want to just wave away fairy tales as being, a nonsense. There's actually a lot of deep truth to fairy tales, which Chesterton is going to elaborate upon throughout the whole chapter, and he does it in a really beautiful way. And then he's also going to talk about what are the implications in our own personal lives when it comes to reading these fairy tales. What do they mean for us, especially for us in the modern world? How do we interpret fairy tales? What do they mean to us? And what use do they perhaps have? Okay, so let me give you a slide very quickly, just showing you the ideas which the chapter is going to explore. So you should see a slide on the screen. And as you'll see, ideas, number one is the ideal is more real than the reality. So we're going to talk about that. We'll then look at two principles of democracy, as Chesterton explains them. We'll then talk about the fact that democracy and tradition are actually the same idea, which is very interesting. We're then going to explore about 3 to 4 fundamental ideas which Chesterton is going to break down. And that's basically where he explores why fairy tales are not just, why fairy tales are not just tales, but they actually have a really deep value. And then we'll look at humility and gratitude as the ideal attitudes towards life and existence. And then we'll look at the fact that all good should be stored and held sacred, and preserving these tales and the messages that they give us is really something that we shouldn't gawk at, but something we should actually take seriously. So this is a very rough overview of the ideas, but now what we're going to do is I'm going to read through the chapter. I will then give you some slides, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so let's begin. Chapter 4, the Ethics of Alfland, which is Chesterton's, in his own words, Chesterton's attempt to utter the unutterable, to say things that cannot be said. And he begins, when the businessman rebukes the idealism of his office boy, it is commonly in some such speech as this: "Ah, yes, when one is young, one has these ideals in the abstract, and these castles in the air. But in middle age they all break up like clouds, and one comes down to a belief in practical politics, to using the machinery one has and getting on with the world as it is. Thus, at least, venerable and philanthropic old men, now in their honored graves, used to talk to me when I was a boy. You know, your idealism is sort of misplaced. It's just castles in the air. What are you doing with these? Why are you even entertaining these thoughts? But since then, I have grown up and have discovered that these philanthropic old men were telling lies. What has really happened is exactly the opposite of what they said would happen. They said that I should lose my ideals and begin to believe in the methods of practical politicians. Now, I have not lost my ideals in the least. My faith in fundamentals is exactly what it always was. What I have lost is my old childlike faith in practical politics. I am still as much concerned as ever about the Battle of Armageddon, but I am not so much concerned about the general election. As a babe, I leapt up on my mother's knee at the mere mention of it. No, the vision is always solid and reliable. The vision is always a fact. It is the reality that is often a fraud. As much as I ever did, more than I ever did, I believe in liberalism. But there was a rosy time of innocence when I believed in liberals. So just notice there at the end of that sentence, right? As much as I ever did, I believe in liberalism, but there was a rosy time of innocence when I believed in liberals. Liberalism being the ideal, the thing which is stable and unchanging. But the people that are actually implementing those ideals and trying to live them out is what is constantly changing. So that just bolsters the fact behind what Chesterton is trying to say, that ideals are actually the more stable aspect of reality, as opposed to the people that try to carry them out, which is always changing. So here I'd like to bring up a slide just to show you this point in an easier way to comprehend it. So the ideal is more real than the reality. And here we have that quote again: as much as I ever did, more than I ever did, I believe in liberalism, but there was a rosy time of innocence when I believed in liberals. Reality is always shifting and changing, but the ideal is always solid and reliable. Okay, so now, after having taken that idea, Chesterton's going to bring this over to democracy, but he's going to give you an explanation of democracy as he understands it, as he understands true democracy, what it is, what it means, and how we arrive at that point of view. So we continue. I take this instance of one of the enduring faiths because, having now to trace the roots of my personal speculation, this may be counted, I think, as the only positive bias. I was brought up a liberal, and have always believed in democracy, in the elementary liberal doctrine of a self-governing humanity. If anyone finds the phrase vague or threadbare, I can only pause for a moment to explain that the principle of democracy as I mean it can be stated in two propositions. Okay, so what are those two propositions? That's a good question. Let's have a look at the slide. So, the principles of democracy, which shape Chesterton's view. Number one, the things common to all people, to all men, are more important than the things peculiar to any man. The things that we have in common are more important than the things that we don't. Number two, and principle number two builds upon principle number one. Chesterton says that the political instinct is one of the things we hold in common. Okay, so Chesterton says that mankind recognizes these universal functions. The fact that the things we hold in common are more important than the things we don't. Mankind recognizes this, and democracy classes government among them. The most important things, as a consequence, must be left to ordinary people to decide upon. Okay, what are these most important things? Well, sex, raising children, and the laws of the state. This is the democracy that Chesterton has always believed in. I'll now continue to read, and you'll see these ideas played out in the text. So, Chesterton says, the principle of democracy, as I mean it, can be stated in two propositions. The first is this, that the things common to all men are more important than the things peculiar to any man. Ordinary things are more valuable than extraordinary things. Nay, they are more extraordinary. It's the ordinary things. Okay, so here I'm just speaking. Let me take down this slide for a moment. So it's the ordinary things that we all share in common. And Chesterton says they are actually more incredible. They are more extraordinary than the exceptions, than the things that we don't hold in common. And that's why they should be treated so seriously, right? Why we should take them so seriously. Man is something more awful than men, something more strange. The sense of the miracle of humanity itself should be always more vivid to us than any marvels of power, intellect, art, or civilization. I want to read that again because that's a really important point. Chesterton says, the sense of the miracle of humanity itself should be always more vivid to us than any marvels of power, intellect, art, or civilization. And while things like power, art, and civilization are incredibly impressive, the miracle of man, the fact that we're here at all, should always be the main thing that causes us to pause and to sort of gawk in wonder. Okay, so man is something more awful than men, something more strange. The mere man on two legs as such should be felt as something more heartbreaking than any music and more startling than any caricature. Death is more tragic than even death by starvation. Having a nose is more comic even than having a Norman nose. So that line, death is more tragic even than death by starvation, I think what Chesterton's getting at is, yes, death by starvation is tragic, but death itself, the fact that we die, is already something to just astound when you stop to think about it. This is the first principle of democracy, and now he's going to summarize that point. So just to refresh you, remember the first principle is the things common to all men are more important than the things peculiar to any man. He summarizes the essential things in men are the things they hold in common, not the things they hold separately. And the second principle is merely this, that the political instinct or desire is one of these things which they hold in common. Falling in love is more poetical than dropping into poetry. The democratic contention is that government, helping to rule the tribe, is a thing like falling in love, and not a thing like dropping into poetry. Now, what does that mean? A thing like falling in love? Well, I think it means that it's something that is part of us, just like falling in love seems to be a part of the human condition. The principle of democracy, Chesterton is arguing, is fundamental to human experience. Now, bear in mind, according to Chesterton's conception of democracy, it is more fundamental to us than maybe even writing poetry, just as falling in love is more fundamental than writing poetry, because falling in love comes almost naturally. It's not something you can learn or even would need to learn. Then Chesterton says, and now he's talking about the democratic instinct, it is not something analogous to playing the church organ, painting on vellum, discovering the North Pole, that insidious habit, looping the loop, being astronomer royal, and so on. For these things we do not wish a man to do at all unless he does them well. It is on the contrary a thing analogous to writing one's own love letters or blowing one's own nose. These things we want a man to do for himself, even if he does them badly. I am not here arguing the truth of any of these conceptions. I know that some moderns are asking to have their wives chosen by scientists, and they may soon be asking, for all I know, to have their noses blown by nurses. Here's an important point. I merely say that mankind does recognize these universal human functions, and that democracy classes government among them. In short, the democratic faith is this, that the most terribly important things must be left to ordinary men themselves. The mating of the sexes, the rearing of the young, how we raise our children and everything that surrounds that, the laws of the state. This is democracy, and in this I have always believed that the most terribly important things must be left to ordinary men themselves. This is why I think a lot of people feel an immediate discomfort at the idea of the government getting too much into our homes, telling us how we should raise our children, how we should regulate our intimate relationships. Chesterton, I believe, is suggesting here that these aspects of our lives should be left to us to figure out. Now, of course, and I won't go on too much of a tangent. Of course, when we start going to other people's houses and doing things, that's a problem. But in terms of the way a person chooses to raise their child, assuming they're not abusing the child, of course, these things must be left to the ordinary people themselves. The alternative would likely be far worse. Okay, then, but there is one thing that I have never from my youth been able to understand. Oh, we're going to get to the second point now. This is a good one. I have never been able to understand where people got the idea that democracy was in some way opposed to tradition. And this takes us to the next slide. Ooh, this is a good one. Democracy and tradition are the same idea. And this takes us to Chesterton's extremely famous line, tradition is the democracy of the dead. Tradition is, and here, these are sort of like summarized notes that I've put together. And then I'll read through the whole chapter. So tradition is democracy extended and sustained through time. And this is why legends are more respected than history books, because legends are formed by the majority of people in the village, whereas the book is usually written by one person. This is why fables and fairy tales are important. Tradition forms as a consequence of collective agreements made by the majority. Therefore, collective agreement made by the majority thus reflects Chesterton's notion of democracy. Okay, let me read the chapter, and then you'll see these ideas playing out. I've never been able to understand where people got the idea that democracy was in some way opposed to tradition. It is obvious that tradition is only democracy extended through time. It is trusting to a consensus of common human voices rather than to some isolated or arbitrary record. The man who quotes some German historian against the tradition of the Catholic Church, for instance, is strictly appealing to aristocracy. He is appealing to the superiority of one expert against the awful authority of the mob. It is quite easy to see why a legend is treated, and ought to be treated, more respectfully than a book of history. The legend is generally made by the majority of the people in the village who are sane. The book is generally written by the one man in the village who is mad. Those who urge against tradition that men in the past were ignorant may go and urge it at the Carlton Club, along with the statement that voters in the slums are ignorant. It will not do for us. If we attach great importance to the opinion of ordinary men in great unanimity when we are dealing with daily matters, then there is no reason why we should disregard it when we are dealing with history of fable. Wow, that is... I'm going to read that again, just in case you didn't catch it. If we attach great importance to the opinion of ordinary men in great unanimity, if we say that, it's very important to consider the opinions of everyday men in a democratic sense, well, then we shouldn't stop doing that when it comes to fables and legends. We should take these things seriously as well, since they emerge as a consequence of a majority of people making decisions and reflecting their experiences and putting it into text. Why would we not look at these stories with the same level of curiosity, enthusiasm? Okay, so let's consider the next point. Tradition may be defined as an extension of the franchise. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. Okay, so tradition is democracy. The traditions that pass down to us from our ancestors are as a consequence of the ideas which people considered to be valuable. And as time progresses, they pass down to us, and we can look around at the people that are currently alive and think, oh, these people, we should just listen to them. But we're a small and arrogant oligarchy when you compare us to the vast majority of humans that have lived in the past, right? So I believe this is the point Chesterton's trying to make here, that tradition and democracy they're inseparable. All Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Tradition objects to their being disqualified by the accident of death. So deep. So all Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Just because you were born, right? Chesterton's being a little bit facetious here. He's saying that it's the accident of birth, and your vote should still count. You're born, your vote should count. That's the democratic inclination, right? But then Chesterton adds on to that, and he says, well, what tradition does, it does the same thing, except it says we don't want to disqualify people due to the accident of death. Just because those people are gone, it doesn't mean that the realizations and the values that they might have formulated are worthless. In fact, quite the opposite. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our groom. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father. I, at any rate, cannot separate the two ideas of democracy and tradition. It seems evident to me that they are the same idea. We will have the dead at our councils. The ancient Greeks voted by stones. These shall vote by tombstones. It is all quite regular and official, for most tombstones, like most ballot papers, are marked with a cross. Amazing. I have first to say, therefore, that if I have had a bias, it was always a bias in favor of democracy and therefore of tradition. Before we come to any theoretic or logical beginnings, I am content to allow for that personal equation. I have always been more inclined to believe the ruck of hard-working people than to believe that special and troublesome literary class to which I belong. I prefer even the fancies and prejudices of the people who see life from the inside to the clearest demonstrations of the people who see life from the outside. I would always trust the old wives' fables against the old maids' facts. As long as wit is mother, wit it can be as wild as it pleases. Now, I have put together a general position, and I pretend to no training in such things. I propose to do it, therefore, by writing down one after another the 3 or 4 fundamental ideas which I have found for myself, pretty much in the way that I found them. Then I shall roughly synthesize them, summing up my personal philosophy or natural religion. Then I shall describe my startling discovery that the whole thing had been discovered before. It had been discovered by Christianity. But of these profound persuasions, which I have to recount in order, the earliest was concerned with this element of popular tradition, and without the foregoing explanation touching tradition and democracy, I could hardly make my mental experience clear. As it is, I do not know whether I can make it clear, but I now propose to try. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a refresher as to where we are. We began by talking about the fact that the ideal is more real than the reality, right? The reality is always changing, it's shifting, it's moving around, but the ideal is always solid and reliable. Chesterton expresses this idea by saying that he's always believed in liberalism, but it's liberals that he has a problem with, right? Because the ideal is wonderful, it's great, but the problem is the way the world operates, things are constantly changing. And so from this, Chesterton reaches the conclusion that the ideal is more real than the reality, since the reality is unstable, but the ideal never changes. We then had a look at Chesterton's description of democracy. He gave us 2 principles which shape his view of democracy. Number 1 is that the things that are common to all men are more important than the things peculiar to any man. The things we have in common are more important than the things we don't. One of those things we all have in common is the political instinct. As a consequence, because we can recognize these universal functions, and democracy classes government among them, the most important things must be left to ordinary people to decide upon. This includes raising children, the laws of the state, and sex. This is the democracy that Chesterton has always believed in. And then we talked about the fact that democracy and tradition are the same idea. And this leads us to the point where we see that if tradition is ultimately just a consequence of the majority's experiences condensed into valuable bits of knowledge which we can pass on through time, then fables and fairy tales, which also emerge from the majority of people, are going to be very, very important. And so the collective agreement made by the majority actually reflects Chesterton's notion of democracy, because democracy and tradition are really the same idea. So now what Chesterton is saying, just before I looked at the recap with you, he wanted to give you that breakdown to show you why tradition is important, why it's essentially democracy, sustained through time. Tradition is the democracy of the dead. And now he's going to use that as the scaffolding, as the framework upon which to give you a few fundamental ideas. Really great ideas. So we're going to explore that now. Let me put another slide on for all of you. So we're going to look at a few fundamental ideas, and the first one is that fairy tales are not mere fantasies. Quote, "Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense." End quote. Earth does not judge heaven, heaven judges earth. The earth does not criticize fairy tales criticize the earth. Fairy tales explore the metaphysical truth behind the physical events of the world. Quote, "This is the great lesson of the Beauty and the Beast, that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. Fairy tales create, within the individual, a certain way of looking at the world." Okay, so that's just an overview. I'm now going to read the points, and then we'll reflect a little bit. Let's see if the stream is still working. Okay, so my first and last philosophy, that which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learnt in the nursery. I generally learnt it from a nurse, that is, from the solemn and star-appointed priestess at once of democracy and tradition. The things I believed most then, the things I believe most now, are the things called fairy tales. They seem to me to be the entirely reasonable things. They are not fantasies. Compared with them, other things are fantastic. Compared with them, religion and rationalism are both abnormal, though religion is abnormally right, and rationalism abnormally wrong. Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. It is not earth that judges heaven, but heaven that judges earth. So for me at least, it was not earth that criticized Alfland, but Alfland that criticized the earth. And when Chesterton says Alfland, he just means the land that fairy tales try to describe and instill into the person who's reading them. I knew the magic beanstalk before I had tasted beans. I was sure of the man in the moon before I was certain of the moon. This was at one with all popular tradition. Modern minor poets are naturalists and talk about the bush or the brook, but the singers of the old epics and fables were supernaturalists and talked about the gods of the brook, of the bush and brook. So this actually adds on to that point I mentioned earlier. You'll see on the screen one of the golden points. I'll just read it. Fairy tales explore the metaphysical truth behind the physical events of the world. Okay, so now listen to again what Chesterton said. Modern minor poets are naturalists and talk about the bush or the brook, right? The physical events of the world. But the singers of the old epics and fables were supernaturalists and talked about the gods of the brook and the bush. So you know the word super in Latin just means above. So when you talk about a supervisor at a company, super, above, visor, vizier, to look, vision. So the supervisor looks from above. If you talk about a superhero, you have the sort of standard hero, the firefighter, or say the doctor. That's the hero, traditionally. And then you have the superhero, the one above even the heroes. You then have the natural, and then above the natural, the supernatural. So Chesterton's just trying to express that idea through this line. So they weren't just painting the bush and the brook. They were talking about the gods behind the bush and the brook, the supernatural reality behind things. That is what the moderns mean when they say that the ancients did not appreciate nature because they said that nature was divine. Old nurses do not tell children about the grass, but about the fairies that dance on the grass. And the old Greeks could not see the trees for the dryads. But I deal here with what ethic and philosophy come from being fed on fairy tales. I deal here with what ethic and philosophy come from being fed on fairy tales. What is the ethic? What is the philosophy that emerges as a consequence of fairy tales? What do they instill into a child when they hear them? If I were describing them in detail, I could note many noble and healthy principles that arise from them. Okay, so now what Chesterton's going to do is he's going to list all the principles that are taught through fairy tales. Obviously, he's not going to go through every fairy tale, but he's going to list a few ones that many people are familiar with, and he'll give you the deeper insight into each one. So, there is the chivalrous lesson of Jack and the Giant Killer, that giants should be killed because they are gigantic. It is a manly mutiny against pride as such, for the rebel is older than all the kingdoms, and the Jacobin has more tradition than the Jacobite. There is the lesson of Cinderella, which is the same as that of the Magnificat, exaltavit humilis, which is, he has exalted the humble. Luke, chapter 1, verse 52. There is the great lesson of Beauty and the Beast, that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. Right? The beast needs to be loved before it becomes a prince. There is the terrible allegory of the Sleeping Beauty, which tells how the human creature was blessed with all birthday gifts, yet cursed with death, and how death also may perhaps be softened to a sleep. But I am not concerned with any of the separate statues of Alfland, but with the whole spirit of its law, which I learnt before I could speak, and shall retain when I cannot write. I am concerned with a certain way of looking at life, which was created in me by fairy tales, but has since been meekly ratified by the mere facts. So it's pretty common, I think, these days to see people looking into the value of fairy tales. If you've watched any Jordan Peterson, you'll know that he does this a lot, right? He even does it with Harry Potter and a lot of popular shows and movies and stories. He'll go deeper and he'll show you the individual lessons. He even does it with the Bible. But Chesterton is not so much going to spend this chapter just listing the individual merits of the stories or the individual moral lessons, but he's actually going to try to get behind the whole spirit of the law itself. Why is it that these stories try to convey something to us? Where does that come from? Okay, it's a very good question, and as we explore it and as we read on, let's look at another slide. So we just looked at this one, which is that fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. And we mentioned that the great lesson of the Beauty and the Beast is that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. And fairy tales create within the individual a certain way of looking at the world. Now, a common misconception about fairy tales is that they don't affirm reason or rationality. On the contrary, they do. And this is what Chesterton's going to explore next. So, let's have a look. Fairyland admits that reason is a necessity. So, for example, if the ugly sisters are older than Cinderella, it is necessary that Cinderella is younger than the ugly sisters, right? If they're older, Cinderella must be younger. It's just logic, right? If Jack is the son of the miller, then the miller is the father of Jack. Straightforward. Sequences like this are mathematical and logical. Cold reason declares it from her awful throne, and we in fairyland submit. So fairyland is full of this true rationalism, right? Fairyland is not completely nonsensical. And this is the first point Chesterton's trying to show you before he takes you to the fundamental point. So, and this is building up to a very interesting conclusion. So, let's have a look. It might be stated this way. There are certain sequences or developments, cases of one thing following another, such as a chicken coming from an egg. There are certain sequences of developments, cases of one thing following another, which are, in the true sense of the word, reasonable. They are, in the true sense of the word, necessary. Such are mathematical and merely logical sequences. We in fairyland, who are the most reasonable of all creatures, admit that reason and that necessity. So here we go to those points I mentioned. For instance, if the ugly sisters are older than Cinderella, it is, in an iron and awful sense, necessary that Cinderella is younger than the ugly sisters. There is no getting out of it. Haeckel may talk as much fatalism about that fact as he pleases. It really must be. If Jack is the son of a miller is the father of Jack. Cold reason declares it from her awful throne, and we in fairyland submit. If the three brothers all ride horses, there are 6 animals and 18 legs involved. That is true rationalism, and fairyland is full of it. But as I put my head over the hedge of the elves and began to take notice of the natural world, I observed an extraordinary thing. And this is the genius point Chesterton's going to lead us to. I observed that learned men in spectacles were talking of the actual things that happened, dawn and death and so on, as if they were rational and inevitable, in the same way as if you're the son, he is your father, right? Talking about dawn and death as necessity, as logical and mathematical necessity, in the same way that, if that person is older than me, I am by default younger than that person. If I am a bachelor, I am by default not married, right? So he says they talked as if the fact that trees bear fruit were just as necessary as the fact that 2 in 1 trees makes 3. Okay, I'm going to read that again because this idea, I don't know, when I read it first, I didn't get it the first time I read it. I had to read it a few times for it to really sink in, because it goes pretty deep into the way we observe the world, the way we perceive the world. It challenges that on a very deep level. So I'll read that again. I observed that learned men in spectacles were talking of the actual things that happened, dawn and death and so on, as if they were rational and inevitable. They talked as if the fact that trees bear fruit were just as necessary as the fact that 2 in 1 trees make 3. But it is not. There is an enormous difference by the test of fairyland, which is the test of the imagination. You cannot imagine 2 and 1 not making 3. Right? There's certain things you just can't imagine. But you can easily imagine trees not growing fruit. You can imagine them growing golden candlesticks or tigers hanging by the tail. These men in spectacles spoke much of a man named Newton, who was hit by an apple, and who discovered a law. But they could not be got to see the distinction between a true law, a law of reason, and the mere fact of apples falling. If the apple hit Newton's nose hit the apple. That is a true necessity, because we cannot conceive the one occurring without the other. But we can quite well conceive the apple not falling on his nose. We can fancy it flying ardently through the air to hit some other nose, of which it had a more definite dislike. We have always, in our fairy tales, kept this sharp distinction between the science of mental relations, in which there really are laws, and the science of physical facts, in which there are no laws, only weird repetitions. We believe in bodily miracles, but not in mental possibilities. We believe that a beanstalk climbed up to heaven, but that does not at all confuse our convictions on the philosophical question of how many beans make 5. Okay, so I want to bring up the slide here, and if this idea is not making sense, be patient, because eventually it will. Okay, let's see. So we talked about the fact that fairyland admits that reason is a necessity. So, quote, you cannot imagine 2 and 1 not making 3, but you can easily imagine trees not growing fruit. Fairy tales make the distinction between logical sequences, which adhere to certain laws, and physical facts, in which there are no laws but only repetitions. Effects do not arise obviously from their causes. Scientific men muddle their minds until they imagine a necessary mental connection between an apple falling from a tree and it reaching the ground. They talk as if they had found a truth which connects 2 marvelous facts. But just because one incomprehensible thing constantly follows another incomprehensible thing does not equal a comprehensible fact. 2 strange riddles do not make a non-strange answer. And now we continue to read. Here is the peculiar perfection of tone and truth in the nursery tales. The man of science says, cut the stalk and the apple will fall. But he says it calmly, as if the one idea really led up to the other. The witch in the fairy tale says, blow the horn and the ogre's castle will fall. But she does not say it as if there was something in which the effect obviously arose out of the cause. Doubtless she has given the advice to many champions and has seen many castles fall. But she does not lose either her wonder or her reason. She does not muddle her head until it imagines a necessary mental connection between a horn and a falling tower. But the scientific men do muddle their minds until they imagine a necessary mental connection between an apple leaving the tree and an apple reaching the ground. They do really talk as if they had found not only a set of marvelous facts, but a truth connecting those facts. They do talk as if the connection of two strange things physically connected them philosophically. Okay, I'll read that again. They do talk as if the connection of 2 strange things physically connected them philosophically. They feel that because one incomprehensible thing constantly follows another incomprehensible thing, the 2 together somehow make up a comprehensible thing. 2 black riddles making a white answer. In fairyland, we avoid the word law, but in the land of science they are singularly fond of it. Thus they will call some interesting conjecture about how forgotten folks pronounce the alphabet Grimm's Law, but Grimm's Law is far less intellectual than Grimm's fairy tales. The tales are, at any rate, certainly tales, while the law is not a law. So Chesterton is now going to break down really what he means by that earlier comment where he said that there is a difference between things which happen due to logical necessity and things which we observe in the physical world. So for example, there doesn't seem to be any necessary mental connection between the fact that a chicken comes from an egg, and yet that's always what happens. But Chesterton is saying that we don't want to go into this sort of fatalism of thinking that things had to be that way. The grass may as well just have been red. The sky may as just as well have been another color. This is the perception he's trying to show you. Let's continue. And I should say, this is Chesterton's attempt, and he claims it himself, to utter the unutterable, right? So it is a really difficult idea to convey, but we'll get through it. Okay, so a law implies that we know the nature of the generalization and enactment, not merely that we have noticed some of the effects. If there is a law that pickpockets shall go to prison, it implies there is an imaginable mental connection between the idea of prison and the idea of picking pockets. And we know what the idea is. We can say why we take liberty from a man who takes liberties, but we cannot say why an egg can turn into a chicken any more than we can say why a bear could turn into a fairy prince. As ideas, the egg and the chicken are further off from each other than the bear and the prince, for no egg in itself suggests a chicken, whereas some princes do suggest bears. Granted, then, that certain transformations do happen, it is essential that we should regard them in the philosophic manner of fairy tales, and not in the unphilosophic manner of the science and the, quote, laws of nature. When we are asked why eggs turn to birds or fruits fall in autumn, we must answer exactly as the fairy godmother would answer if Cinderella asked her why mice turned to horses or her clothes fell from her at 12 o'clock. We must answer that it is magic. It is not a law, for we do not understand its general formula. It is not a necessity, for though we can count on it happening practically, we have no right to say that it must always happen. It is no argument for unalterable law, as Huxley fancied, that we count on the ordinary course of things. We do not count on the ordinary course of things, we bet on them. We risk the remote possibility of a miracle, as we do that of the poisoned pancake or a world-destroying comet. We leave it out of account, not because it is a miracle and therefore an impossibility, but because it is a miracle and therefore an exception. Okay, so before we move on, I just want to open another slide here. Let's see. Okay, so just to summarize what we've just read, fairy tales are not mere fantasies. If there is a law that says thieves go to prison, it creates a mental connection between prison and thievery. But we cannot say why an egg turns into a chicken any more than we can explain why a frog turns into a prince. Transformations happen in nature, but we should regard them in the philosophic manner of fairy tales, but not in the unphilosophic manner of science and the laws of nature. Why do trees produce apples? Why do eggs turn into birds? Why do fruits fall in autumn? The word magic is actually more appropriate than the word law. We can count on these things happening practically, but they are not a necessity. We have no right to say that these things must always happen. We do not count on the ordinary course of things, we bet on them. And I really want to point out to all of you that Chesterton, when he was writing this, Orthodoxy was his attempt to explain how he came to believe in Christianity, right? So some of you might think, well, instead of calling it magic, why not just call it providence, right? God's providence. This is why things occur the way that they do. But Chesterton is trying to take you chapter by chapter to the point where he reaches that conclusion. So when he refers to it as magic, I wouldn't take it in a bad way. That is the way he understood the events of the world at that time of writing. So as Orthodoxy continues, Chesterton will show you how these observations he made about the world are actually best encapsulated and conveyed in Christianity. Everything that he's saying here in this chapter about fairy tales and the truth that they convey is actually already present within the Christian worldview, which is the astonishing realization he comes to. So, having said all of that, let's have a quick look if the stream's still running. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I see a bunch of comments. I'm going to have a look through them pretty soon. I'll probably look at them at the end of the reading, and then we'll go through them, because I've often thought about starting a podcast called The Tangent, where I just go on tangents, because I have a really bad habit of going on tangents, and I know that if I start reading through the chat, I'm just going to go on 50 tangents and we'll never finish the reading. So I'll look at that at the end. Okay, so let's continue. And where were we? So, all the terms used in the science books, law, necessity, order, tendency, and so on, are really unintellectual because they assume an inner synthesis which we do not possess. The only words that ever satisfied me as describing nature are the terms used in the fairy books: charm, spell, enchantment, because they express the arbitrariness of the fact and its mystery. A tree grows fruit because it is a magic tree. Water runs downhill because it is bewitched. The sun shines because it is bewitched. I deny altogether that this is fantastic or even mystical. Now, this is an important point, because I can completely see how somebody would say to Chesterton, this is just this is just mystic talk. This is just completely fantastical, wishful thinking. So he addresses that now. Listen to what he says. I deny altogether that this is fantastic or even mystical. I deny it. We may have some mysticism later on, but this fairy tale language about things is simply rational and agnostic. It is the only way I can express in words my clear and definite perception that the one thing is quite distinct from another, that there is no logical connection between flying and laying eggs. It is the man who talks about a law that he has never seen who is the mystic. It is the man who talks about a law that he's never seen who is the mystic. Nay, the ordinary scientific man is strictly a sentimentalist. He is a sentimentalist in this essential sense, that he is soaked and swept away by mere associations. He has so often seen birds fly and lay eggs that he feels as if there must be some dreamy, tender connection between the two ideas, whereas there is none. A forlorn lover might be unable to dissociate the moon from lost love, so the materialist is unable to dissociate the moon from the tide. In both cases there is no connection except that one has seen them together. A sentimentalist might shed tears at the smell of apple blossom, because, by a dark association of his own, it reminded him of his boyhood. So the materialist professor, though he conceals his tears, is yet a sentimentalist, because by a dark association of his own, apple blossoms remind him of apples. But the cool rationalist from fairyland does not see why, in the abstract, the apple tree should not grow crimson tulips. It sometimes does in his country. Let's have another look here at the next slide. So just to summarize what we've just said, and just to extract the key points, there is no logical connection between flying and laying eggs. It is the man who talks about a law that he has never seen who is the mystic. The words in science books, law, necessity, order, tendency, they assume an inner synthesis, which we do not possess. Fairy tale descriptions are more accurate, charm, spell, enchantment, since they express the mystery of the world. This is not a mystical or fantastical view. It is the man who claims there is a fundamental law which he has never seen who is mystical. The rationalist of fairyland sees that an apple tree may just as well grow crimson tulips. The wonder for the world does not come from fairy tales. Fairy tales come from this wonder. And that's a point we're going to touch on in a moment. Quote, "These tales say that apples were golden, only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. They make rivers run with wine, only to make us remember for one wild moment that they run with water. Okay, so let's continue. This elementary wonder, however, is not a mere fancy derived from fairy tales. On the contrary, all the fire of fairy tales is derived from this. Okay, so that's the point that the slide just showed you, which is that this sense of wonder at the world doesn't come from fairy tales. Fairy tales are a consequence of this wonder which we experience within. Just as we all like love tales because there's an instinct of sex, we all like astonishing tales because they touch the nerves of the ancient instinct of astonishment. This is proved by the fact that we are very young children. This is proved by the fact that when we are very young children, we do not need fairy tales. We only need tales. Mere life is interesting enough. A child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon. But a child of 3 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door. Boys like romantic tales, but babies like realistic tales, because they find them romantic. In fact, a baby is about the only person, I should think, to whom a modern realistic novel could be read without boring him. This proves that even nursery tales only echo an almost prenatal leap of interest and amazement. These tales say that apples were golden, only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. They make rivers run with wine, only to make us remember, for one wild moment, that they run with water. I have said that this is wholly reasonable and even agnostic, and indeed, on this point, I am all for the higher agnosticism. Its better name is ignorance. So, I haven't created a slide for this next point, because I have the book here, and I've just written, I don't know if you can see that, I've written profound, and then just drew a line down. So I'm just going to read that for you. But before we move on, I just want to make sure I'm not skipping a slide here that I wanted to show all of you. Okay, good. Thank you for your patience, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so let's read this now. We have all read in scientific books, and indeed in all romances, the story of the man who has forgotten his name. This man walks about the streets and can see and appreciate everything. Only he cannot remember who he is. Well, here it comes. Every man is that man in the story. Every man has forgotten who he is. One may understand the cosmos, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, but thou shalt not know thyself. We are all under the same mental calamity. We have all forgotten our names. We've all forgotten what we really are. All that we can call common sense and rationality and practicality and positivism only means that for certain dead levels of our life, we forget that we have forgotten. All that we call spirit and art and ecstasy only means that for one awful instant, we remember that we forget. But though, like the man without memory in the novel, we walk the streets with a sort of half-witted admiration, still it is admiration. It is admiration in English, and not only admiration in Latin. The wonder has a positive element of praise, and this is the next milestone to be definitely marked on our road through fairyland. I shall speak in the next chapter about optimists and pessimists in their intellectual aspect, so far as they have one. Here I am only trying to describe the enormous emotions which cannot be described, and the strongest emotion was that life was as precious as it was puzzling. It was an ecstasy because it was an adventure. It was an adventure because it was an opportunity. The goodness of the fairy tale was not affected by the fact that there might be more dragons than princesses. It was good to be in a fairy tale. The test of all happiness is gratitude, and I felt grateful, though I hardly knew to whom. Children are grateful when Santa Claus Children are grateful when Santa Claus puts in their stockings gifts of toys or sweets. Could I not be grateful to Santa Claus when he puts in my stockings the gift of 2 miraculous legs? We thank people for birthday presents of cigars and slippers. Can I thank no one for the birthday present of birth? Wow. There were then these two first feelings, indefensible and indisputable. The world was a shock, but it was not merely shocking. Existence was a surprise, but it was a pleasant surprise. In fact, all my first views were exactly uttered in a riddle that stuck in my brain from boyhood. The question was, what did the first frog say? And the answer was, Lord, how you made me jump. That says succinctly all that I am saying. God made the frog jump, but the frog prefers jumping. But when these things are settled, there enters the second great principle of the fairy philosophy. Anyone can see it who will simply read Grimm's fairy tales, or the fine collection of Mr. Andrew Lang. For the pleasure of pedantry, I will call it the Doctrine of Conditional Joy. This takes us to another slide. Sorry about that. The Doctrine of Conditional Joy. The strongest emotion was that life was as precious as it was puzzling. Reading from the slides, in fairyland, all ethics hinge upon an if. You may live in a palace of gold and sapphire if you do not say the word cow, or you may live happily with the king's daughter if you do not show her an onion. The modern man rebels against what he understands. The denizen of fairyland obeys something that he does not understand at all. In the fairy tale, an incomprehensible happiness rests upon an incomprehensible condition. If you eat the apple, the hope of God is gone. So, let's explore this idea, the doctrine of conditional joy, which informs the ethics of Alfland, which is the chapter. So, touchstone... I will call it the doctrine of conditional joy. Touchstone talked of virtue in an if. According to Alfland ethics, all virtue is an if. The note of the fairy utterance always is, you may live in the palace of gold and sapphire if you do not say the word cow, or you may live happily with the king's daughter if you do not show her an onion. The vision always hangs upon a veto. All the dizzy and colossal things conceded depend upon one small thing withheld. All the wild and whirling things that are let loose depend upon one thing that is forbidden. Mr. W.B. Yeats, in his exquisite and piercing elfin poetry, describes the elves as lawless. They plunge in innocent anarchy on the unbridled horses of the air. Reading now from Yeats, ride on the crest of the dishevelled tide, and dance upon the mountains like a flame. Back to Chesterton. It is a dreadful thing to say that Mr. W.B. Yeats does not understand fairyland, but I do say it. He is an ironical Irishman, full of intellectual reactions. He is not stupid enough to understand fairyland. Fairies prefer people of the yokel type like myself. People who gape and grin and do as they are told. Mr. Yeats reads into Alfland all the righteous insurrection of his own race. But the lawlessness of Ireland is a Christian lawlessness founded on reason and justice. The Fenian is rebelling against something he understands only too well. But the true citizen of fairyland is obeying something that he does not understand at all. In the fairy tale, an incomprehensible happiness rests upon an incomprehensible condition. A box is opened, and all the evil flies out. A word is forgotten, and cities perish. A lamp is lit, and love flies away. A flower is plucked, and human lives are forfeited. An apple is eaten, and the hope of God is gone. Why is this? Why are the ethics of Alfland so dependent upon an if? It's a good question, right? Well, this is exactly what Chesterton's going to explain now. This is the tone of fairy tales, and it is certainly not lawlessness or even liberty, though men under a mean modern tyranny may think it liberty by comparison. People out of Portland Gaol might think Fleet Street free, but closer study will prove that both fairies and journalists are the slaves of duty. Fairy godmothers seem at least as strict as other godmothers.
Cinderella received a coach out of Wonderland and a coachman out of nowhere. But she received a command, which might have come out of Brixton, that she should be back by 12. Also, she had a glass slipper, and it cannot be a coincidence that glass is so common a substance in folklore. This princess lives in a glass castle, that princess on a glass hill. This one sees all things in a mirror. They may all live in glass houses if they will not throw stones. For this thin glitter of glass everywhere is the expression of the fact that the happiness is bright but brittle, like the substance most easily smashed by a housemaid or a cat. And this fairy tale sentiment also sank into me and became my sentiment towards the whole world. I felt, okay, so before I go on, remember when I asked, why do all the ethics of Alfland hinge on an if? Well, this is why. I felt and feel that life itself is as bright as a diamond, but as brittle as a window pane. And when the heavens were compared to the terrible crystal, I can remember a shudder. I was afraid that God would drop the cosmos with a crash. Remember, however, that to be breakable is not the same as to be perishable. Just because something can break doesn't mean that it will perish automatically. Strike a glass, and it will not endure an instant. Simply do not strike it, and it will endure 1,000 years. Such, it seemed, was the joy of man. Either in Alfland or on earth, the happiness depended on not doing something, which you could at any moment do, and which, very often, it was not obvious why you should not do. It all hinges on an if. Now, the point here is that to me, this does not seem unjust. If the miller's third son said to the fairy, "Explain why I must not stand on my head in the fairy palace," the other might fairly reply, "Well, if it comes to that, explain the fairy palace." If Cinderella says, "How is it that I must leave the ball at 12?" her godmother might answer, "How is it that you think you are going..." Sorry about that. Her godmother might answer, "How is it that you are going there till 12? If I leave a man in my will 10 talking elephants and 100 winged horses, he cannot complain if the conditions partake of the slight eccentricity of the gift. He must not look a winged horse in the mouth." And it seemed to me that existence was itself so very eccentric a legacy that I could not complain of not understanding the limitations of the vision when I did not understand the vision they limited. Okay, so what's the point Chesterton's making here? Well, he's trying to say that this if condition isn't really unjust. And I think in some ways he's kind of appealing to ignorance, because I'll just read that line again and I think you'll see what I mean. And it seemed to me that existence was itself so eccentric a legacy. Life is so eccentric, right? I could not complain of not understanding the limitations of the vision when I did not even understand the vision that they limited. The frame was no stranger than the picture. That's such a great metaphor, right? Because frames are limitations to pictures. And the limitation is the fact that there's a limitation is no stranger than the actual thing itself. The fact that there's a frame is no stranger than the image itself, right? But the limitation is part of the image. The beginning of every painting is its frame. The frame was no stranger than the picture. The veto might well be as wild as the vision. It might be as startling as the sun, as elusive as the waters, as fantastic and terrible as the towering trees. For this reason, we may call it the fairy godmother philosophy, I could never join the young men of my time in feeling that what they called the general sentiment of revolt. I should have resisted, let us hope, any rules that were evil, and with these and their definition I shall deal in another chapter. But I did not feel disposed to resist any rule merely because it was mysterious. Estates are sometimes held by foolish forms, the breaking of a stick or the payment of a peppercorn. I was willing to hold the huge estate of earth and heaven by any such feudal fantasy. It could not well be wider than the fact that I was allowed to hold it at all, At this stage, I give only one ethical instance to show my meaning. I could never mix in the common murmur of that rising generation against monogamy. Applicable to today. Because no restriction on sex seemed so odd and unexpected as sex itself. To be allowed, like Endymion, to make love to the moon and then to complain that Jupiter kept his own moons in a harem seemed to me, bred on fairy tales like Endymion's, a vulgar anticlimax. Keeping to one woman is a small price to pay for so much as seeing one woman. To complain that I could only be married once was like complaining that I had only been born once. It was incommensurate with the terrible excitement of which one was talking. It showed not an exaggerated sensibility to sex, but a curious insensibility to it. A man is a fool who complains that he cannot enter Eden by 5 gates at once. Polygamy is a lack of the realization of sex. It is like a man plucking 5 pears in mere absence of mind. The aesthetes touched the last insane limits of language in their eulogy on lovely things. The thistledown made them weep. A burnished beetle brought them to their knees. Yet their emotion never impressed me for an instant. For this reason, that it never occurred to them to pay for their pleasure in any sort of symbolic sacrifice. Men, I felt, might fast 40 days for the sake of hearing a blackbird sing. Men might go through fire to find a cowslip. Yet these lovers of beauty could not even keep sober for the blackbird. They would not go through common Christian marriage by way of recompense to the cowslip. Surely one might pay for extraordinary joy in extraordinary morals. So, we had a look at that already. So just to sum up what we've said so far, and that was quite a long read, but let's have a look. So as we were discussing the doctrine of conditional joy, we mentioned a quote: "She had a glass slipper, and it cannot be a coincidence that glass is so common a substance in folklore." Chesterton points out that glass is bright but brittle, which is the quality of happiness in life. Like glass, happiness is bright but brittle. Life is bright as a diamond, but brittle as a window pane. Breakable, however, is not the same as perishable. If you strike glass, it's gone in an instant, but if you do not strike it, it will endure. In fairyland and earth, happiness depends on not doing something, which you could do at any moment. We understand so little of existence. Why complain of the limitations when we do not even understand the existence they limit? We should pay for extraordinary joy in extraordinary morals. Now, the modern world denies fairyland in 2 ways. Number 1, it says everything is as it must have always been, which is scientific fatalism. And number 2, it denies the strict limitations and conditions set by fairyland. So what we're going to do now is we're going to continue with this chapter, and you will see these 2 points, how the modern world denies fairyland. You'll see them basically laid out and explored by Chesterton. And let's begin. Great. Surely one might pay for extraordinary joy in ordinary morals. Oscar Wilde said that sunsets were not valued because we could not pay for sunsets. But Oscar Wilde was wrong. We can pay for sunsets. We can pay for them by not being Oscar Wilde. Well, I left the fairy tales lying on the floor of the nursery, and I have not found any books so sensible since. I left the nurse guardian of tradition and democracy, and I have not found any modern type so sanely radical or so sanely conservative. But the matter for important comment was here, that when I first went out into the mental atmosphere of the modern world, I found that the modern world was positively opposed on 2 points to my nurse and to the nursery tales. It has taken me a long time to find out that the modern world is wrong and my nurse was right. The really curious thing was this, that modern thought contradicted this basic creed of my boyhood on its 2 most essential doctrines. I have explained that the fairy tales founded in me two convictions. First, that this world is a wild and startling place, which might have been quite different, but which is quite delightful. Second, that before this wildness and delight, one may well be modest and submit to the queerest limitations of so queer a kindness. But I find the whole modern world running like a high tide against both my tenderness and the shock of that collision created two sudden and spontaneous sentiments, which I have had ever since, and which, crude as they were, have since hardened into convictions. First, I found the whole modern world talking scientific fatalism, saying that everything is as it must always have been, being unfolded without fault from the beginning. The leaf on the tree is green because it could not have been anything else. Now, the fairy tale philosopher is glad that the leaf is green precisely because it might have been scarlet. He feels as if it had turned green in an instant before he looked at it. He is pleased that snow is white on the strictly reasonable ground that it might have been black. Every color has in it a bold quality as of choice. The red of God and I need to read that again. Every color has in it a bold quality as of choice. The red of God and roses is not only decisive, but dramatic, like suddenly spilt blood. He feels that something has been done. But the great determinists of the 19th century were strongly against this native feeling that something had happened an instant before. In fact, according to them, nothing ever really had happened since the beginning of the world. Nothing ever had happened since existence had happened, and even about the date of that they were not very sure. The modern world, as I found it, was solid for modern Calvinism, for the necessity of things being as they are. But when I came to ask them, I found they really had no proof of this unavoidable repetition in things, except the facts that things were repeated. Now, the mere repetition made the things to me rather more weird than more rational. The fact that things constantly repeat, that eggs always, eggs always go to birds. I'm speaking very generally now. I know that's not always the case, but the fact that things are always repeating, to Chesterton, this is actually makes things weirder than rational. I mean, I'll just read that again, then we'll move on. The mere repetition made the things to me rather more weird than more rational. It was as if, having seen a curiously shaped nose in the street and dismissed it as an accident, I had then seen 6 other noses of the same astonishing shape. I should have fancied for a moment that it must be some local secret society. So, one elephant having a trunk was odd, but all elephants having trunks looked like a plot. I speak here only of an emotion, and of an emotion at once stubborn and subtle. But the repetition in nature seemed sometimes to be an excited repetition, like that of an angry schoolmaster saying the same thing over and over again. The grass seemed signaling to me with all its fingers at once. The crowded stars seemed bent upon being understood. The sun would make me see him if he rose 1,000 times. The recurrences of the universe rose to the maddening rhythm of an incantation, and I began to see an idea. All the towering materialism which dominates the modern world rests ultimately upon one assumption, a false assumption. It is supposed that if a thing goes on repeating itself, it is probably dead, a piece of clockwork. People feel that if the universe was personal, it would vary. If the sun were alive, it would dance. This is a fallacy even in relation to known fact, for the variation in human affairs is generally brought into them not by life, but by death, by the dying down or breaking off of their strength or desire. A man varies his movements because of some slight element of failure or fatigue. He gets into an omnibus because he is tired of walking, or he walks because he is tired of sitting still. But if his life and joy were so gigantic that he never tired of going to Islington, he might go to Islington as regularly as Thames goes to Sheerness. The very speed and ecstasy of his life would have the stillness of death. The sun rises every morning. I do not rise every morning, but the variation is due not to my activity, but to my inaction. Now, to put the matter in a popular phrase, it might be true that the sun rises regularly because he never gets tired of rising. His routine might be due not to a lifelessness, but to a rush of life. And we are fast approaching an incredibly profound idea which Chesterton's about to unravel. The thing I mean can be seen, for instance, in children. When they find some game or joke that they specially enjoy, a child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not absence of life. I'll read that again. A child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not absence of life. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free. Therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, "Do it again!" And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, "Do it again," to the sun, and every evening, "Do it again," to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It may be that He has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. I'm going to have to call an ambulance. The repetition in nature may not be a mere recurrence. It may be a theatrical encore. Oh, I love that. Let me read that again. The repetition in nature may not be a mere recurrence. It may be a theatrical encore. Heaven may encore the bird who laid an egg. If the human being conceives and brings forth a human child instead of bringing forth a fish or a bat or a griffin, the reason may not be that we are fixed in an animal fate without life or purpose. It may be that our little tragedy has touched the gods, and that they admire it from their starry galleries, and that at the end of every human drama, man is called again and again before the curtain. Repetition may go on for 1,000,000 years, by mere choice, and at any instant it may stop. Man may stand on earth generation after generation, and yet each birth be his positively last appearance. This was my first conviction, made by the shock of my childish emotions meeting the modern creed in mid-career. I had always vaguely felt facts to be miracles in the sense that they are wonderful. Now I began to think them miracles in the stricter sense that they were willful. I mean that they were, or might be, repeated exercises of some will. In short, I have always believed that the world involved magic. Now I thought that perhaps it involved a magician, and this pointed a profound emotion always present and subconscious, that this world of ours has some purpose. And if there is a purpose, there is a person. I had always felt life first as a story, and if there is a story, there is a storyteller. Wow. But modern thought also hit my second human tradition. It went against the fairy feeling about strict limits and conditions. The one thing it loved to talk about was expansion and largeness. Herbert Spencer would have been greatly annoyed if anyone had called him an imperialist, and therefore it is highly regrettable that nobody did. But he was an imperialist of the lowest type. He popularized this contemptible notion that the size of the solar system ought to overawe the spiritual dogma of man. Why should a man surrender his dignity to the solar system any more than to a whale? If mere size proves that man is not the image of God, then a whale may be the image of God, a somewhat formless image, what one might call an impressionist portrait. It is quite futile to argue that man is small compared to the cosmos, for man was always small compared to the nearest tree. But Herbert Spencer, in his headlong imperialism, would insist that we had in some way been conquered, and annexed by the astronomical universe. He spoke about men and their ideals exactly as the most insolent unionist talks about the Irish and their ideals. He turned mankind into a small nationality, and his evil influence can be seen even in the most spirited and honorable of later scientific authors, notably in the early romances of Mr. H.G. Wells. Many moralists have, in an exaggerated way, represented the earth as wicked, but Mr. Wells and his school made the heavens wicked. We should lift up our eyes to the stars from whence would come our ruin. But the expansion of which I speak was much more evil than all this. I have remarked that the materialist, like the madman, is in prison. In the prison of one thought. So Chesterton here is referring back to, I believe it's chapter 2, The Maniac, where he talks about, I won't go into it now, but he basically talks about the fact that the materialist actually closes the world in on himself, and it actually leads to a sort of mental suicide. Check out chapter 2 if you'd like to see more about that. It's really interesting. I have remarked that the materialist, like the madman, is in prison, in the prison of one thought. These people seem to think it singularly inspiring to keep on saying that the prison was very large. The size of this scientific universe gave one no novelty, no relief. The cosmos went on forever, but not in its wildest constellation could there be anything really interesting, anything, for instance, such as forgiveness or free will. The grandeur or infinity of the secret of its cosmos added nothing to it. It was like telling a prisoner in Reading Gaol that he would be glad to hear that the Gaol now covered half the country. The warder would have nothing to show the man except more and more long corridors of stone lit by ghastly lights and empty of all that is human. So these expanders of the universe had nothing to show us except more and more infinite corridors of space lit by ghastly suns and empty of all that is divine. In fairyland there had been a real law, a law that could be broken. For the definition of a law is something that can be broken. But the machinery of this cosmic prison was something that could not be broken, for we ourselves were only a part of its machinery. Wow, I need to read that again. In fairyland there had been a real law, a law that could be broken, for the definition of a law is something that can be broken. But the machinery of this cosmic materialist prison was something that could not be broken, for we ourselves were only a part of the machinery. We were either unable to do things or we were destined to do them. The idea of the mystical condition quite disappeared. One can neither have the firmness of keeping laws nor the fun of breaking them. The largeness of this universe had nothing of that freshness and airy outbreak which we have praised in the universe of the poet. This modern universe is literally an empire. That is, it was vast, but it is not free. One went into larger and larger windowless rooms big with Babylonian perspective, but one never found the smallest window or a whisper of outer air. Their infernal parallels seem to expand with distance, but for me all good things come to a point. Swords, for instance. So finding the boast of the big cosmos so unsatisfactory to my emotions, I began to argue about it a little. And I soon found that the whole attitude was even shallower than could have been expected. According to these people, the cosmos was one thing since it had an unbroken rule. Only, they would say, while it is one thing, it is also the only thing there is. Why then should one worry particularly to call it large? There is nothing to compare it with. It would be just as sensible to call it small. A man may say, I like this vast cosmos, with its throng of stars and its crowd of very creatures. But if it comes to that, why should not a man say, I like this cozy little cosmos, with its decent number of stars, and as neat a provision of livestock as I wish to see. One is as good as the other. They are both mere sentiments. It is a mere sentiment to rejoice that the sun is larger than the earth. It is quite as sane a sentiment to rejoice that the sun is no larger than it is. A man chooses to have an emotion about the largeness of the world. Why should he not choose to have an emotion about its smallness? It happened that I had that emotion. When one is fond of anything, one addresses it by diminutives, even if it is an elephant or a life guardsman. The reason is that anything, however huge, that can be conceived of as complete, can be conceived of as small. If military moustaches did not suggest a sword or tusks a tail, then the object would be vast because it would be immeasurable. But the moment you can imagine a guardsman, you can imagine a small guardsman. The moment you really see an elephant, you can call it tiny. If you can make a statue of a thing, you can make a statuette of it. These people profess that the universe was one coherent thing, but they were not fond of the universe. But I was frightfully fond of the universe and wanted to address it by a diminutive. I often did so, and it never seemed to mind. Actually, and in truth, I did feel that these dim dogmas of vitality were better expressed by calling the world small than by calling it large. You know, a bigger cosmos doesn't equal less mystery, right? For about infinity, and we actually are coming up to the end of the chapter now, so we're about to round things off. For about infinity, there was a sort of carelessness which was the reverse of the fierce and pious care, which I felt touching and pricelessness and the peril of life. They showed only a dreary waste, but I felt a sort of sacred thrift, for economy is far more romantic than extravagance. To them stars were an unending income of halfpence, but I felt about the golden sun and the silver moon as a schoolboy feels if he has 1 sovereign and 1 shilling. These subconscious convictions are best hit off by the colour and tone of certain tales. Thus I have said that stories of magic alone can express my sense that life is not only a pleasure, but a kind of eccentric privilege. I may express this other feeling of cosmic coziness by allusion to another book always read in boyhood, Robinson Crusoe, which I read about this time, and which owes its eternal vivacity to the fact that it celebrates the poetry of limits, nay, even the wild romance of prudence. Crusoe is a man on a small rock with a few comforts just snatched from the sea. The best thing in the book is simply the list of things saved from the wreck. The greatest of poems is an inventory. Every kitchen tool becomes ideal because Crusoe might have dropped it in the sea. It is a good exercise in empty or ugly hours of the day to look at anything, the coal scuttle or the bookcase, and think how happy one could be to have brought it out of the sinking ship onto the solitary island. But it is a better exercise still to remember how all things have had this half-breadth escape. Everything has been saved from a wreck. Every man has had one horrible adventure, as a hidden untimely birth he had not been. As infants that never see the light, men spoke much in my boyhood of restricted or ruined men of genius, and it was common to say that many a man was a great might-have been. To me, it is a more solid and startling fact that any man in the street is a great might-have not been. But I really felt, the fancy may seem foolish, as if all the order and number of things were the romantic remnant of Crusoe's ship. That there are 2 sexes and 1 son was like the fact that there were 2 guns and 1 axe. It was poignantly ardent that none should be lost, but somehow it was rather fun that none could be added. The trees and the planets seemed like things saved from the wreck, and when I saw the Matterhorn, I was glad that it had not been overlooked in the confusion. I felt economical about the stars, as if they were sapphires. They are called so in Milton's Eden. I hoarded the hills, for the universe is a single jewel, and while it is a natural cant to talk of a jewel as peerless and priceless, of this jewel it is literally true. This cosmos is indeed without peer and without price, for there cannot be another one. Thus ends, in unavoidable inadequacy, the attempt to utter the unutterable things. These are my ultimate attitudes towards life, the soils for the seeds of doctrine. These in some dark way I thought before I could write, and felt before I could think. That we may now proceed more easily afterwards, I will roughly recapitulate them. I felt it in my bones first that this world does not explain itself. It may be a miracle with a supernatural explanation, it may be a conjuring trick with a natural explanation, but the explanation of the conjuring trick, if it is to satisfy me, will have to be better than the natural explanations I have heard. The thing is magic, true or false. Second, I came to feel as if magic must have a meaning, and meaning must have someone to mean it. There was something personal in the world, as in a work of art. Whatever it meant violently. Third, I thought this purpose beautiful in its old design, in spite of its defects such as dragons. Fourth, that the proper form of thanks to it is some form of humility and restraint. We should thank God for beer and burgundy by not drinking too much of them. We owed also an obedience to whatever made us. And last, and strangest, there had come into my mind a vague and vast impression that in some way all good was a remnant to be stored and held sacred out of some primordial ruin. Man had saved his goods as Crusoe saved his goods. He had saved them from the wreck. All this I felt, and the age gave me no encouragement to feel it. And all this time I had not even thought of Christian theology. And that is the end of, I think, one of the most incredible chapters. That ending, though, right? I mean, Chesterton always goes for the dramatic ending, and he breaks all of this down. He goes into all this detail, and then at the end he says, I've had all these inclinations. I've known this since before I could think, and I've thought about all this for most of my life, and I've written it all down, and I've presented my ideas to you, and I've been thinking about all this, and I haven't even thought of Christian theology yet. So what's really interesting is right at the beginning of the chapter, Chesterton points out that he comes to a realization of his natural philosophy or his religion, and then once he comes to that realization, he realizes that Christianity got there before him. And ultimately, as I already said, Orthodoxy is Chesterton's attempt to explain why his personal philosophy and how he came to believe in the Christian worldview, in the Christian faith. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that reading. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for... And this was a very long stream. I'm not sure exactly how long we've been going. It's been a while. But I want to just end this off by saying a big thank you to all of you. If you would like to support this channel, if you are not already a subscriber, please consider subscribing. There will be links in the bio. My podcast and the show, Existential Delight, is now available on Spotify. So you can find all my recordings, podcasts, music, all that stuff is now going to be on Spotify. I've also got a bunch of interviews lined up, which will be coming in the next few weeks, with a few other YouTubers talking about all the good stuff, applying Chestertonian thought to modern issues. And then, are there any books you'd like me to break down? Leave a comment down below, let me know. I look forward to all of your responses. And having said all of that, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've come to the end of the stream. I'm going to take a moment to have a look at the chat and see if there were any questions. This is definitely my most vivid chat so far, which is nice. Okay, awesome. Well, I'm going to end this off just by saying a big thank you to David Casey. Thanks for your comment. I appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy the chapter. I think this was a good one. This is definitely the most detail I haven't gone into a chapter with this much detail before. And I'm going to do that with each preceding chapter. I do plan to do the whole book. I've even got the thumbs up from the Chesterton Society, so I'm just going to go through the whole book.
It does take a lot of time to prep these because I don't want to rush them. And obviously, I do read a lot of commentaries on the chapters so that when I actually break down the ideas, I'm not misrepresenting them. Of course, there will probably be a time where I make a mistake, but if I do that and I realize it, I will point that out in a future video. So if I do make a mistake, it is what it is. I'll try to avoid that. But for the most part, I should also point out that a lot of this is my own interpretation, right? So a lot of the time I'm giving commentary, I am telling you what I think Chesterton is trying to convey just based on my immediate impressions. And then I'll also draw on commentaries to inform my opinion. But I'm definitely not going to be 100% of the time. It's very difficult to understand fully what a person is saying, especially when you're talking about Chesterton, because he does speak in paradox, he does speak in a lot of metaphor, and there are different ways you can interpret what he's trying to say, especially the Ethics of Alfland. But having said all of that, I hope you all feel this was a work of goodwill. I certainly intended it to be so. This has been Existential Delight. My name is Dylan. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you wherever you are on the planet, and I will see you in the next video or the next stream, whatever it might be. Goodbye for now.